Hey, welcome back to ENL 3, Introduction to Literature, Being Human in a More Than Human World. Got a slightly different kind of video for you today. Instead of talking about a specific poem, as I did in the previous weeks, today I'm going to talk about a specific literary device, imagery. So we're going to focus on what imagery is, how it's used in poems, and how we can begin to analyze it, as you'll do in this week's weekly writing response. So, first of all, imagery is one of the main building blocks of a poem and one of the primary tools at the poet's disposal. We can define imagery as anything that invokes or refers to or draws upon one of the five senses, or maybe more than one of the five senses. And the opposite of imagery is abstractions. So, abstract language, things that don't invoke the five senses, is the opposite of imagery, which does invoke one or more of the five senses. That's sort of a binary, but we can also use it or imagine it as kind of a scale. Some language is more abstract than others. Some language is more imagistic, more concrete, more vivid than others. So, for example, like exhaustion. Exhaustion is kind of an abstraction. You might know what it feels like, but the word itself doesn't specifically invoke any of the five senses. It's rather abstract. And then if you said, like, he felt a heavy exhaustion, that's a little bit more concrete, a little bit more imagistic, a little bit less abstract, but still not as concrete as you could be. It could be like, exhaustion was weighing on him like a backpack full of bricks. And that's like much more imagistic, much more concrete bricks. So another scale that you can analyze and characterize imagery on is the scale from literal to figurative. On the one hand, you have literal images that are just realistic descriptions of whatever is going on in the poem. And on the other hand, figurative language, and there's all kinds of different figurative literary devices. We're talking about metaphors, similes, personification sometimes, synecdoche, all kinds of fancy stuff, and each of those devices has its own flavor, has its own thing that it does. But overall, figurative language is imagery that is not literal. And again, that's something that exists kind of on a scale. You can have something in between super literal and super figurative, right? So how you would employ that in analyzing a poem. Last week I talked about Lucille Clifton's poem, Cutting Greens, where she uses heavily literal imagery throughout almost the entire poem until she gets to that one really figurative image, the kitchen twists dark on its spine. And so we would notice, oh, she really prefers literal imagery for most of the poem. We might ask why that is. But then there's this turning point where it gets really figurative. So those are two scales that you can analyze imagery on. Imagery serves a lot of purposes and functions in poetry. Obviously, it helps bring the poem to life, helps us imagine it in a vivid way, helps us see it in our mind's eye or whatever. But imagery does a lot more than just bring the poem to life and let us picture it. There's a lot of purposes and functions to imagery in poetry. It can show us something new or interesting about the thing being described. It can pose surprising comparisons or juxtapositions between two things you wouldn't really think about comparing. It can help create mood, tone, atmosphere, ambiance in the poem, stuff like that. And it can also form different kinds of connections and associations. Imagery can refer to, be a reference to specific cultural contexts, can allude to other stories or myths. It can create a world of connections and associations for you. So just an example of how imagery does all of this stuff. If a poet said, like, the restaurant was as busy as an Easter Sunday church service, that would show me how busy the restaurant was, but it also creates all kinds of emotional and imaginary connections and associations, right? And that's way different than if the poet said, the restaurant was as busy as the DMV on a Monday afternoon. Both of these images show me that the restaurant's busy, help me picture it, but they create very different moods, very different connections, and possibly suggest different themes that the poet would then dig into. So the goal of analyzing imagery is to ask questions about what a specific image is doing, what are its connections, feelings, associations, how does it build themes in the poem, and then how does it connect to the other images in the poem? How do the images add up to a system that's creating a world and a set of emotions and associations? So I wanted to give one specific example from a reading for this week. We're reading poems by Sylvia Plath and by Lee Young Lee. And this example comes from Sylvia Plath's poem, Spinster. But we don't have to worry about the whole poem yet. I'm just going to talk about one specific image. So in Plath's poem, Spinster, she says, heart's frosty discipline, exact as a snowflake. Heart's frosty discipline, exact as a snowflake. So if I'm analyzing this image, first of all, I noticed that it's heavily figurative. There's not really much literal imagery description going on here. It's like highly figurative. And it actually stacks multiple figurative devices on top of or into one another. So there's personification. The heart has discipline. That's personification. The discipline is described as frosty, and that's like a metaphor, a metaphorical description. And finally, there's a simile. This discipline is exact as a snowflake. And so these are three different figurative images combined together. Each one has its own flavor and thing that it's doing. But taken together, this is like a highly metaphorical image, right? So what does this metaphorical image do? First of all, I noticed that it's creating an association between nature and human emotions, specifically between winter and human emotions, and the attempt to restrain human emotions, discipline. And so that's interesting. It's creating kind of an unusual or surprising juxtaposition. Usually when I think of the heart as like the center of emotions, I don't think of it as frosty, disciplined, exact, right? I think about it as like warm, mushy, sympathetic, forming, connections and emotional bonds. Here, it's a very different description. So the image is flipping my expectations, and it's creating an unusual juxtaposition. And then finally, that simile at the end, exact as a snowflake. That simile is telling me that this discipline is exact, is sculpted like a snowflake, but the image is doing a lot more than just what it explicitly says. That snowflake image carries with it a lot of associations. I know that snowflakes are unique, right? Everyone is different, and so I'm like, is that another thing that the poet is saying about the heart, that it's this unique individual thing? But the other thing about snowflakes is that even though they're all individual and unique, they usually come in these waves, right? It's hard to pick apart one snowflake from a blizzard or a snowstorm. And so it's saying something about the heart being completely unique and individual, but also just one more thing in a big sea of unique individual hearts, right? Finally, snowflakes, we know, are fragile. They melt, they break, etc. They need specific conditions to be created. And so all of this is getting packed into that one little simile, that one image. All of these different ideas about what the heart is, what the emotions of a human being are, and stuff like that. And so I might, if I was analyzing this in further depth, peel it back a little bit farther and ask, what is it saying about the relationship between emotions and nature or the environment? Is it saying that these problems of being an individual in a group, problem of being fragile, the problem of human experience overall, is that really natural? Is it connected to nature in a way that we don't usually expect? So these are questions I would ask. That's how to dig into just one specific image, and then you start connecting it to your analysis of the rest of the poem. Thanks, y'all.